Okay, in today's video, I'm going to show you some basics of Adobe Illustrator. And before we jump into Illustrator, it's worth just looking a little bit about the difference between an Illustrator program, which is a vector program, and an image editing software like Photoshop, which is a bitmap image editor. So the difference between vector and bitmap. Really, it's easier to show you the difference with an image. So if we go over to this image here of this logo, it's a honeybee logo. You can see that it's nice and smooth and clean and flat, really. And it doesn't have to be flat. You've got some gradients in here, but that's kind of the logo itself. It's nice, clean, smooth. If I jump over to Photoshop, it looks very similar. It's smooth, it's clean, it's flat. It's the same image. Jump back to Illustrator. Now, if I go to this blank document here, Illustrator is a vector program. And what that basically means is a vector is basically a mathematical equation. And in Illustrator, what Illustrator is concerned with are paths, anchor points, and handles. And if you can get your head around that bit, you're going to be fine. It's a bit like driving a car. You don't need to be a mechanic to know how to drive a car, but you do need to know where the gear stick is and to be able to do the indicators. Oh, and hold the steering wheel, press the pedal down. You get what I'm talking about. So we're going to go over to here and I'm going to show you what each of those things are. So an anchor point, you click, click, and you add an anchor point. If I zoom in, you can see this anchor point a bit clearly. So what happens is it's got storing information about this anchor point here, and then if I click here, it's storing information about this anchor point here. And the math says between this point and this point, it's straight. Okay, nothing's happening, it's just a straight line. Now this time, if I do an anchor point here, do an anchor point there, and then an anchor point there, and stretch. Now what's happening, it's saying you've got an anchor point here. I've actually got two if you look, because I double clicked it. You've got an anchor point here, and you've got an anchor point here, and the maths is saying between these two anchor points, I want the path to curve, and this is your handle. So this handle, I should be able to edit this handle. So if I swizzle this handle around, this handle is basically saying what direction is this path going in. And what happens if I swizzle it that way? And it's basically constantly adjusting, and it's a mathematical thing between these two things. Now, what does that matter to you? Well, if I do that if I just put a line on there, what does that matter to you? Well, as a designer, you know that file sizes become massive. If you're working in Photoshop, the file sizes are massive. If you're working at A3, your computer starts slowing down a bit. With Illustrator, the file size stays small because it's only got to have the information from each of the anchor points and the paths and the handles, the mathematical equations. So it's mathematical equations between points. That's all it's got to keep. So the file sizes generally are much smaller in Illustrator. Now let's go over to the Photoshop file here. If I zoom in fact, no, let's go back to Illustrator and show you here, because it's quite important to understand why that matters. If you zoom in on this image, because it's vector, it doesn't matter how big you go. It always stays crisp and clean. It will not distort at all. There is no distortion there. It doesn't matter how closely I zoom in. Just click off there. It doesn't matter how close I zoom in on that. It just stays clean. Because it's just math, so it stays that kind of that information it keeps all of the imagery together. It's not working in pixels, which is a bitmap image. Now, if we go into Photoshop and we zoom in at this point here, you can see that it's starting to get that kind of jagged, pixely edge to it. And if I zoom in further, you can start to see the individual pixels. And now, if I pick an area where there's some difference, if you look now at these individual pixels here, you can see that each individual pixel contains one colour, one colour, two colour, one colour, one colour, one colour, one colour, one colour. And Photoshop has to store information in its memory for every single little square. Now I've made this image pixelate sooner than it normally would, but that's why when in Photoshop you'd work at 300 dots per inch, and that's basically talking about 300 pixels in an inch square. So it creates, with Photoshop and Bitmap, those little pixels create the illusion of continuous tone. The further away you get from it, then it starts to look smooth again. Now, what does that matter? That in Photoshop, bitmap images are pixel-based and Illustrator files are vector-based, so they stay smooth and clean. What does that matter to you as a designer? Why would that be of importance? Well, Illustrator, primarily, its best job, I think, the best use for Illustrator is for logos. I've used Illustrator for the last 15 years, and when I first started out, it was my main program. Now I use Photoshop and more Photoshop and bring Illustrator in because I'm working more with kind of painterly images where pixels are perfect for that kind of thing. But if I was doing a logo like this, I work in Illustrator. If I'm doing typography, I work in Illustrator. Why? Because you've got to think about the usage. Where are these things going to be used? You're the designer designing for a client, and it's going to go somewhere and it's got a job to do. Now, think about a logo and how a logo might be used. Your logo might be used on a banner, it might be used on a flyer, it might be used on a business card, it might be used on a billboard, it might be used on the side of an aeroplane. Massive variations in size. It might be used on a postage stamp. The difference between a postage stamp and the side of a house. So let's have a look. It could be used on the side of a truck and it would still stay crisp and clean. It could be used on a billboard and it would still stay crisp and clean. The size of a house. It doesn't matter what size a vector image goes, it will never distort. And that's really important. If I'm a business owner and I've got a fleet of trucks, a business card, and a massive banner outside my building, then, or I've paid for like a football stadium, some advertising, I don't want my image to go all pixelated and look rubbish. So Illustrator is the way, and the file size is nice and small. So it means you're saving on that kind of file. You can take it to your printer knows how to separate all the colours and print it. Bang, you're on. So that is the difference between vector and bitmap images. And so back to Illustrator again, you're looking at paths and anchor points and handles. Now we've got that, we can move on to the second step of Illustrator. And that is these two little Bobby Dazzlers down here. You've got in Illustrator a fill and a stroke. And it's really important to understand those as well. So if I do this box here, at the moment, you can see this red line, it's basically saying that there is no fill and there is a black stroke. And a stroke is an outline, basically. You're stroking the path. So you've got the path here. Let me just take the stroke off. You can see this blue thing with the anchor points and bounding box. That's a path. It's the kind of blue line. These paths don't print. So you can have paths that don't print. What we can do now is we can decide that we want it to have a red outline, so a red stroke on this box, and I want it to have a yellow fill, so I want it to be yellow inside and a red stroke. So I've got the stroke on the foreground, or I can pick the fill as the foreground. Let's go for the stroke, and we're going to pick a red, like that, and then we want a yellow fill. So I've clicked the little fill button there, and I'm picking yellow. Oh, that's not yellow, that's like a snotty green. Like that, yellow, and if I can just click away. You've got a stroke and a fill. Same with a circle. And let's change that now. So let's say I want a blue one of them, and just pick any colour. Oops, cancel that. Come on. Cancel. Don't mess me around now. I'm going to go for light blue, and I'm thinking blue. Nice and simple. And again, I can zoom in and they stay nice and clean. Now that is your kind of basics to Illustrator. It's about learning to use shapes, using this pen tool, which is the same as in Photoshop. So you've started to use the pen tool. I'm hoping you would have picked that up in Photoshop, but you're using the pen tool, using shapes, and it's basically that kind of economy of working with symbols and shapes and repeating, and that's how Illustrator works. There's another thing that we can play with now as well. In your strokes, if I choose this object here, what I like about Illustrator is I've not got my layers up at the moment. You can see my layers down here. At the moment we're working all in one layer, and it can get a bit cluttered in those layers. But what I like is you can just click and you're on them straight away. If I click this here and I think, right, I like this, but I want my stroke to be much thicker, you can go up to this strokes panel there and just up your stroke. Now this works really well when you're doing logos and stuff, and I'm going to show you that in the next tutorial when we look at making a basic logo. But that is all you kind of need to know as a brief introduction between the difference between vector and bitmap images.